Xiaolu Guo is a novelist, memoirist, and a filmmaker and educator. Her novels include a concise Chinese-English dictionary for lovers and I'm China. Her memoir, Once Upon a Time in the East, won the National Book Critics Circle Award in 2017 and was shortlisted for a prize. Radical was published last year, 2023, and was followed by My Battle of Hastings, which was published in 2024. And these three books completed her autobiographical trilogy. Her recent novel, A Lover's Discourse, was shortlisted for the Goldsmith Prize in 2020. Xiaolu Guo was named Granta's Best of Young British Novelists in 2013, and she has also directed a dozen of award-winning films, including How's Your Fish Today and UFO in Her Eyes. Her feature, She, a Chinese, received the Golden Leopard Award at the Locarno Film Festival in 2009. Her documentary, We Went to Wonderland, was in the national selection of NF at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City, while Once Upon a Time, Proletarian premiered at Venice Film Festival in 2019. Welcome, Xiaolu Guo, to Manchester. It's a pleasure and joy to have you with us tonight.
Thank you.
Great, so shall we start?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So I have prepared a couple of questions, so we'll have about 30 minutes of our conversation around the questions that I've prepared, and then we'll open up to the audience and discussion. So My Battle of Hastings is your latest book, and it's the third book in your trilogy, a Transparent Self Trilogy. So I wanted to ask you about what inspired you to write this trilogy, and what aspects of yourself you're transparent about in these books?
Well, thank you, Elena, and thank you, Peter, for such a welcoming speech. And thanks, everyone. I forgot about this library, so beautiful. I came here a long time ago, 10 years ago. So now, suddenly, kind of memory comes back. It's an amazing city. To talk about these three books, I have to kind of mention some other books before, because I was writing non-stop fictions, those kind of sort of fiction with characters, kind of historic background. But I think the last 10 years was a kind of transitional time. When I decided to return to London from Europe, I was teaching in different universities in Europe, filmmaking and creative writing. And I think returning to London after Brexit, and then later on, there's pandemic, and I think forced me to think about this concrete reality, which I'm kind of, totally kind of immersed in this new English reality. And I thought about how to write about this concrete life. Basically, I live in England, and that's how Once Upon a Time in the East, which was 10 years ago. And then Radical, which returned just before and during the pandemic when I was in New York teaching. And then this one, Once Upon a Time in the East. So a quick answer to your question is, during the pandemic, I moved to the seaside just to have a year just to think and to relearn about history and life. And I think that's a book was born from that period.
Yeah, but what aspects of kind of your life you felt particularly you needed to be transparent about, and who do you think the audience, who are the readers of this book, that you need to communicate these aspects of your life?
I mean,
to?
I am not a very commercial writer, so even though I wrote novels, make fiction films, I never really know where my audience. I mean, I think it's quite different from. I think a commercial writer, right in the industry, they know what their audience. But even then, I don't believe it. I write what I know. So for me, it's like a diary writing to record the past of the time, but to record the importance of the everyday's life as a foreigner, as an immigrant, or as women, and as artists. And for me, the fragments of daily life reflecting the historical huge events in the past. So My Battle of Hastings is me looking at the English Channel as kind of new local, if you like. If someone doesn't, want me to be local, then I say, okay, a newcomer, new arrival, immigrant, looking at this English channel, which is kind of full of stories, comedy, tragedy, history, memory. And then thinking back 1,000 years ago, the battle between the Normans and the Anglo-Saxons, and how this land, England, has been totally transformed by the 𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃, this battle, which has happened on one day in October 1,000 years ago, and how somehow England inherited this French chivalry, or let's say class system, until today, which we always think is quintessentially English, and is it so? Actually, is it being transplanted from, from Normandy, from that time? So all these are sort of reflection for me in my kind of mundane daily life when I lived there that year when the Russian invasion happened in Ukraine. So for me, it's a way to look at the war, the current war, and the remote war, historical war, along this channel, and to think, what we are, where we are nowadays.
Yeah, what I was particularly struck by reading the last two books, The Radical and My Battle of Hastings, was how personal, almost intimate your voice is, and how much I thought I got to know you, kind of like reading a book written by friends and who you know very well. So your style is highly personal, almost autobiographical. But you say in the past you also wrote fictions, but now you're moving more into this kind of diary or thesaurus, looking for your language kind of writing. And I want to ask you how you experiment with literary forms and how you arrive to this particular form of narrative.
Yeah, I mean, these are great questions, Elena, thank you. And they are large because it really sums up a writer's struggle with language, with forms. And I have to say, in English language, this is my 10th book. I think the switching of a language become very strange. In China, I wrote around 10 books in Chinese, but they are between the essays, poetry collection, short story collection, novels, and some are film theory, which is my original kind of trade, original profession. I trained as filmmaker and a film theorist. But this is the last 20 years I switched to write in English, and I think allowed me to experiment first with language, because when you switch language, the way you're thinking, the way you construct a narrative completely changed. And the very idea of narrative already changed as well, and also the way you look at history, because language is almost a destiny. And I hate to say language is also kind of a strange identity you inhabited. If I were speaking French now, I probably inhabited a lot of, I guess, historical French thinking, but I'm speaking English. And if I switch into another language, or, like you, and I think the mentality, the political stand, the memory changes in a way, because we're so bound to a certain language. I guess that's my complicated way to answer you about exploration. But another thing is beyond the language or beneath the language is this deep structure of narrative, which I'm a storyteller, and I'm very clear, as Jordan Berger said, we are fundamentally storyteller, whether you're a politician or lawyer or comedian, because a great lawyer, a great president has to be storyteller first. And I think it's fundamental. How shall we tell a story? It's about 𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃, a battle between the Normans and Anglo-Saxons, or is it about the Russian war in Ukraine, or is it about our everyday struggle between the peace and the war, the fragile peace, and there's kind of ever-occurring war around the corner, or is it really to do with the interior struggle about our inner life as someone most of my life is spent in writing, and that kind of struggle with the physical life and the interior life. So I think all my books are very fragmented, and with this one, it's the same. It's kind of 2 pages per section, so it's really like zigzags through 𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃, and then current war, and then current life, and then kind of crisscross from history to current life. And this is sort of a form I was using for this book.
Great. You also write in the book, if I may quote, that even though I'm now writing English, I think in Chinese, or at least I think that I think in Chinese. I'm never sure which language is controlling the other. I'm hybrid. Or I'm surprised that I don't feel any resentment or fear of losing my own language, my old language. So I wanted to ask you about this sense of being a hybrid and thinking across different languages, and finding a new language.
Sure. I'm so happy you read Radical before, because I think for me, Radical is much more important to understand my books or my films, because Radical in Chinese, we all know, it's called 部首, is the way the Chinese characters composed. And of course, Radical has other meanings. Russian forward is about being avant-garde. But I think in my narrative, Radical really means the fundamental structure of language. The Chinese words 部首. And in Latin, the same radice is the composition, the foundation of a word in Latin. So it's all connected when we talk about language. When I say hybrid is, I might be speaking English, but I think the thoughts, the identity, if you like, the memory is such a hybrid, it's not pinned to one thing. And I think intellectually I'm very much influenced by the Western literature, the great Western kind of cinema and literature, and I think that almost kind of rewritten the habit I had before I came to this country, when I was 20-something, writing entirely in Chinese language. And that hybridity is not defined by languages. I guess with Radical book, I felt very close to, I felt very intimate to all my books, but some are less so intimate, strangely. And I think I felt very close to Radical and to My Battle of Hastings because they are, of course, most recent. But Radical is a book, I try to somehow using basic two languages, Chinese and English, at least in the title section every 2 pages, kind of unleash a discussion about our multiple identities, multiple possibilities in terms of thinking and the choices, and refuse to be bound into one. And what's interesting, I think, is in political study, the national identity is always put forward as kind of argument. And I think for artists is way sort of is to put all this forward. It's something very interesting, as American linguist, philosopher said, Noam Chomsky said, there's a particular language, and then there's a universal language. There's a universal superstructure underneath the language, whether you speak Russian or Chinese or English or whatever other language. This universal linguistic structure is almost like a superstructure. So you can't escape that superstructure. And I think that's something where, in a way, we cook together from different, I think, whatever you call it, culture, ethnic difference. We are kind of all hybrid. And I think that's the richness of language, or any languages, if the language is alive still. So I use these kind of ideas to write my books. So storytelling might be a bit hidden in the second place, and I think the idea is, it's more urgent for me to express that hybridity, that kind of morphed identities, combined identities.
Yeah, you also have very kind of distinct female writer's voice, and you write about the necessity for women writers to develop their own language. So I quote again from your book, each woman needs to find her own words, that private special vocabulary that she can use to express her condition. To make these words her own, she needs to embark upon etymological journey deep within herself. The words that will be in her possession can be shared but not turned into slogans. They cannot be taken away from the particular. In that sense, I'm neither woman nor Asian, neither worker nor oppressed citizen. I'm just a human who cannot overcome or deny very specific past, set in stone, real, rich in detail, loaded with finely wrought mesh of social baggage. So this is kind of talking about these superstructures and previous, histories, impressions, different struggles that, we as humans embark on. But what about specific battles, struggles, you as a kind of woman writer? encounter.
Well, thank you for mentioning this paragraph. Usually I read, so instead you helped me. So I'm so glad I don't need to read that bit. I mean, normally that's a part I took from Radical because it was so important. I think when I was in New York teaching in Columbia University, I was writing this book, Radical. I almost basically decided to live there in the US. And one night when I was walking along the Hudson River, I saw little crab in and out. And I was thinking about molting, how a crab kind of grow out from the old skin and then leave this old shell. And then the female crab will come out. And that was a moment, a female crab, after molting, have her sexual reproduction process and meeting a male crab. And I think it was a very interesting observation. I just have this one night, couldn't sleep, walk along the Hudson River. I thought about a certain kind of female life, a womanhood, I thought about the idea of a home, or idea of the rooting yourself as an immigrant, and the idea of the rooting become cementing yourself, which means the death of an immigrant, right? So often I think we cement ourselves into the ground rather than root ourselves, because rooting ourselves is grow the branches so healthily, right? And then expand and then have all the nutrition. But cementing yourself is a death. And I think often I make a mistake cementing my life on the ground. And I think that people take as for, oh, thank you, great, you have rooted. And I thought, no, it's a cementing myself. I felt, each book I wrote is sort of, escape is, it sounds like a negative word, but I took it as a very positive word. It's escape to a place which allow yourself to have freedom or free space to think. And I think for women, somehow it's even more kind of burdensome to carry that nerve or strength to move forward. When you mentioned this transparent self, it does refer to Anya Ernaux's speech, when she won the Nobel Prize. I think she was talking about a certain kind of writing without narration, a certain kind of writing like a documentary camera, and a certain kind of writing without fabrication. And then she called that transparent self. And then another idea of what is self? Do you have self? Because maybe many people doesn't have self. And I know I don't have self, S-E-L-F, that word before. That word produced when I was, say, 31 or 33, whatever arbitrary age I could say. Because the self is produced from a whole awareness of the interior desire need of the self, what the self needed. Until you discover that, you don't have that self yet, And I think those kind of thinking are expressed in my last 3 books. And I call them, whatever you call it, life writing or nonfiction or memoir. And I often talk about these 3 books together.
You write about this cementing yourself, kind of for women, as they cement themselves through, children and these domestic responsibilities, and a lot of your reflections, particularly in My Battle of Hastings, and all about this search for freedom, for your artistic exploration, and being away from domesticity. So how do you reconcile this?
I don't know. Reconcile is an interesting idea. Sometimes I thought, isn't it, if you are naturally Buddhistic or even Taoist, you don't reconcile, you're just enlightened. I'm of course bluffing, I don't see myself so easy getting away from the dilemma of human life. But I do think I don't take material life seriously at all. For me, a way of freedom is from creation, from novel writing, from essay writing, from filmmaking, from studying the world, from understanding the deep meaning of the complexity, or the simple meaning of the complexity. And I think sometimes when I look at the Buddhistic text or a Taoist kind of koan, I'm already, getting an answer, but on the other hand, without creativity, life seems to be no weight in a way. And I think, as a you know, so this go beyond the womanhood, and I think apply to men the same. You know, creation is only meaningful liveliness of human life, and I think it's very difficult to talk about that because my books are talking about ideas, not about a particular story or a character. So I'm not traditionally interested in a traditional storytelling. I'm into some ideas. For example, in Radical, there's one concept is in German called a Lebenskünstler, meaning the artist of life. You know, we might not be a certain, say, the boss of an institution or a lawyer or something, but you are Lebenskünstler. I think every man and woman could be a wonderful life artist. You make life as art, and I think that's the highest achievement of being human, because we have imagination. And so those are the concepts I wanted to infuse. So the same thing with My Battle of Hastings. I want to discuss where the class system coming from in England. You know, is it really we think it's from the recent English history, or can go back 1,000 years before? So these are the questions I ask myself, because I really felt to be local is to understand the local history, go back, way back. Otherwise, you never be local. And you live in a non-local life, it's a very desolate, isolated life. And I think it's a book forced myself to become semi-local, and I don't feel yet local. But I think that writing this book is really a kind of quest for me to become, you know, at least I read Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and I didn't manage to read Domesday Book, which is kind of, you know, 3 times bigger than the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. So if you have time, you can go through the Domesday Book. Yeah.
Are you reading it for your next book, the Domesday Book? I wanted to ask you about your engagement with the local history in Hastings, and because it's the first time, I think, I've read most of your books, and in the Battle of Hastings, it's your first time that you've engaged with the local history, and you engaged with the local history chronicles. But you also draw very interesting parallels between, you know, what's happening in the world, current world, but also ancient China, and chronicles across different times and places. But wanted to ask you, what was your kind of biggest surprise when you were reading the local historical chronicles?
I think it's amazing kind of process. You know, it's also very painful to read the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle because it's written in the Old English and no one could read it. So it was translated into modern English. And I think just to go through who slain who killed who, you know, which minister, you know, which churchman, you know, did what, and which king did what, you know. And I think it's this kind of incredible, intense kind of historical chronicle of the ancient Anglo-Saxon history, but written by monks at that time. And before that, of course, I had to study Bede, the English history, you know, the Bede, the 8th century, 9th century great monk. He was also a translator. And I realized this is nothing actually, you know, one unique case, because that time is Tang Dynasty China. So it's transition. So 8th century, 9th century is a great Tang Dynasty, moved towards Song Dynasty. But in between, there's kind of a few kind of small dynasties for the transition from Tang to the Song. And I thought in this book, My Battle of Hastings, I should really somehow do the comparative study, but in a non-academic way, to suggest, you know, during the Battle of Hastings time, around 10th century, 11th century, in China, there's a Song Dynasty, which is a great dynasty in the East, or perhaps the greatest at that time, 11th century. And I just laid out the comparative difference, you know, 11th century, what happens in Normandy, what happened in Anglo-Saxon land, you know, Wessex Kingdom or whatever, you know, the Vikings coming down. But in Song Dynasty in China, you know, which emperor did what? And as you know, I think last speaker you had is Professor Michael Wood, and I think he was saying Song Dynasty right after Tang Dynasty, 11th century is the first world democracy, which I think I found an amazing speech. I think he said it's the first kind of open kind of modern society in the world, and that's only 11th century, you know. Yet 11th century in the West is something else. It's medieval time. It's a war ravaged. Really, you know, it's kind of after the Romans, before the kind of figuration of a European political map. And I think in China, the dynasty has been established for hundreds of years, rather stable. I thought about to suggest that and to see a kind of global map at that time, you know, even though that's 1,000 years ago, to suggest a few personalities. And I mean, this simply I cannot answer in 2 minutes as Peter wanted me to do, but I would to do another time to say the church culture in the West in the 11th century is very interesting. It's by monastery. And the chronicle in the East at that time, during the Tang and Song dynasty, it kept by the courtesans, mainly female ministers. And we also, at that time, after the 𝗱𝗃𝗁𝗃, we had the first female emperor. So the female courtesans in the high court in the Song dynasty, they kept all the record. And that's very interesting contrast of the monks in the church writing chronicles. So for me, all these are very important, but I didn't want to overload such a small essay book. So you read about a page, quite sparse, and then it just abruptly stopped. And I felt perhaps less is more. You know, I think you can learn in the university if you're interested. I think writing this book is kind of restrain myself, but somehow just give you some kind of clue in the East and West comparative study.
One hobby I learned about from reading your books is that you like walking. You write that your existence in the West can be described with the phrase, I came, I saw, I wrote, or more precisely, I came, I saw, and I wandered. So you wander around, you write. Could you discuss how these wanderings and your writing processes relate to each other?
Yeah, I found it very interesting when I was reading how Julius Caesar came to one day swept England. First time that the comment he made, you know, but it's not quite I came, I saw, I conquered, or I left. Basically, he just left, really. I found it very interesting, the very short description, the way he described England. I mean, probably that's just myth and legend. But it's very mysterious time, I think, for everyone to look at the British map. Well, Britain doesn't exist yet. England hasn't become a political reality yet. It's just different kingdoms at that time. I thought about, these days the English channels, every day there's news about refugees, the boat, the immigrants came in, and I thought about the perpetual, this English channel as sort of like a wet battlefield. And I thought about, it's not just metaphor, if I look at what happened 1,000 years ago when William the Conqueror came to England, landing in Hastings, actually Pevensey, the way he conquered with French, Normans, chevaliers. And then nowadays it's a legalistic society, it's nothing to do with conquest. If you want to conquer, you have to use legal terms to make law first in order to go further. I wanted to discuss this, but it was very difficult for me to really write this in the book. So to answer your question in a very elusive way, I had to use metaphor in this book, which I quoted the Rubens, 16th century. He was Dutch, right? Belgian Dutch painter Rubens, this famous painting called The Consequence of War. Somehow to get away a historical discussion, to say the war and the violence is this kind of perpetual human behavior. And in that painting, Zeus and Venus is kind of symbol of the peace. And there's battle between man and woman in that painting. I thought about how to use that painting as sort of my kind of literary device if you like, to take me away from the actual discussion about war and peace. So it's quite difficult to write this book, I have to say, yeah.
I'll ask my final question before opening up to the audience. A question that I'm very curious about. How you're a prolific writer, but you also make films, both documentary films and motion films. And you graduated, your first education was as a filmmaker, Beijing Film Academy, and then you came to the UK also to be trained in film academy here. Yeah. How does your filmmaking practice relate to your writing practice?
Really good question. I often been asked this. Actually, I never know. I was trained forever, you know, since I was early 20s to 30s, you know, as a filmmaker, fiction, documentary, and I don't really make, say, very abstract film. I do make narrative films, long narrative features. But I thought maybe I learned how to write from, it's kind of funny, you know, quoting, you know, I really learned how to write from, say, Fassbinder's cinema or Pasolini's cinema, or, you know, early days, you know, when I watched every single Billy Wilder films, I thought, my God, you know, I learned so much how to write from watching Billy Wilder, or Hitchcock, if you like. I felt, I guess, you know, my generation less so, but the new generation, you are very visual narrative. So my way of writing is somehow very visual, and it's not kind of, you know, congratulating myself. It's almost like a default. It's my kind of almost mistake, you know. When I write, I have to use photos. I know most of my books full photos, but they're not entirely in the sync. They're out of sync with the content, which is deliberate. But I found it very difficult to have pure verbal expression in my book. So the visual become a sort of odd reference. And it's nothing to do with Zibo or that, it's just my film training. But I think I'm so influenced by the European cinema, you know, especially the 60s, Nova Vague, you know, Chris Marker was very important for me. So the visual essays, and of course we don't even mention Godard because Godard is always everyone's reference. But Jean Rouge, those kind of documentary filmmakers, and I think early Hollywood, pre-60s, were so important for me. And I mean, Italian realism is very important. Fellini became very important later on. But when I was younger, in my early 20s, I couldn't really watch Fellini. I found it too real, too concrete. But then, of course, I was wrong. You know, 8.5. Fellini is kind of most metaphorical filmmaker in the world. I learned how to tell story from those filmmakers. But by saying that, I'm absolutely separating filmmaking and writing, because I'm really, you know, belong to that school, which is Robert Bresson, believing the divorce between the theater and the literature, well, between the cinema and the literature. So I don't intend to make any film based on my books, because I don't think they have the same identity. You know, visual narrative is very different from verbal narrative. But I wrote one book called The UFO in Her Eyes in order to make film, because that requires $1 million budget. So I had to write into some silly novel first to get to get funding in the West, and then in order to somehow gather the money to make film. Otherwise, none of my books has foundation for film, and I would never really mix them, because they really belong to different kind of narrative, right? But I found it healthier to have both. Life is so short to one thing, and I felt this kind of need, almost like desire to practice both, to see, you know, which media can take you to where. I think they can't be replaced from each other.
Great, thank you.
Oh, please.